Hi, I'm Dr. Tony Evans, your host for Heroes in the Bible, Jesus. If you've been enjoying this series, please write a review and let me know how this podcast has impacted your life. Welcome to the greatest story ever told. It is the story of a shepherd's heart for his sheep, a father's love for his children, and a hero's triumph over death and darkness. This is a story that continues to shape and mold the world around us, bringing the divine heart of God right into the hearts of you and me. In this episode, Jesus is bound and brought to be tried and killed. The episode starts out slow, as if Jesus is suspending time to connect with his disciples. Even with his impending torture, Jesus takes his time explaining who he is to his disciples. Even in anticipation of his death, Jesus is unhurried, calm, and sturdy. The second half of this episode and the episode after this one are fast-paced and brutal. Let the first half of this episode serve as a deep breath before diving under the wave of the crucifixion. Jesus wants to give you and me clarity, peace, and reassurance that he is in complete control. Look for moments in this episode that showcase the strength of Jesus. And remember, above all else, he is not a victim. Our hero was not drugged to the cross. He marched there with purpose and passion. Before this episode begins, we have a prelude, a moment in Scripture that connects to our story. We will be taken to a different time, but at the same exact location. King David, hundreds of years before Jesus, stood at the same exact brook and made a choice. Would he run away from his attackers or face them? The prelude will draw a contrast between David and Jesus. As great as David was, he was not even close to being the hero Jesus was. I hope you enjoyed this episode. My prayer is that you would be reassured of Christ's strength, and that would give you reassurance that you can be strong in him. Here is episode 17, God on Trial.
Prelude to chapter 17. It was late, and the moon's light trickled in through the lattice of David's bedroom. The night was quiet. However, there was an uneasiness in the air. David lay there asleep, content to dream of battles fought and victories won. However, his peaceful sleep was swiftly interrupted as the large wooden door swung open violently.
"My king,"
the messenger said.
"Arise. They are coming for you."
David swung his feet over the bed and took his sword. "What is it?" David asked.
"It's Absalom, your son. The hearts of the people have been corrupted, and they are now making him king over you."
As the messenger was saying these words, David could hear a bursting through the palace doors. David dressed himself and sheathed his sword. He jumped out of the window and rolled onto the ground below. David sent word to all his loyal servants that they must flee, for Absalom would not deal kindly with them. "Go quickly!" David yelled. "There's no limit to Absalom's cruelty. We must go before the tip of the sword reaches your neck." His servants and all the clans that were loyal to him packed their things and left the city. They marched at night through the city streets, seeking to avoid the swift sword of Absalom. The entire land began to weep as they saw their king flee from danger. The man they had entrusted with their lives, and the man who had slain giants, was now running from his own son. Afraid for his life, David ran to the Mount of Olives. Flowing from the city was a babbling brook called Kidron. Its crystal-clear water reflected David's sorrow back at him. With tears in his eyes and fear in his heart, King David stepped over the brook to run from his enemies. Chapter 17. God on Trial. The air was cool as the dense fog rolled over the Mount of Olives. Jesus had taken his disciples to a precious place, the Garden of Gethsemane. The trees stood tall and proud above them. Their branches were interwoven, creating a beautiful archway above them. It was quiet in the garden. The birds had settled into their nests for the night, and the gentle chirps of crickets filled the air. Jesus walked a few paces in front of the disciples. He stopped and placed his hand on a large tree. He looked up and sighed. The disciples had never seen Jesus like this before. He was quiet, contemplative, and isolated. He turned back to them with his familiar smile and gestured for them to sit underneath the tree. Jesus sat on a large root sticking out of the ground. He looked and placed his hands on his chest.
Let not your hearts be troubled by what will happen next.
Jesus encouraged.
Believe in God and also in me. In my Father's house there are many rooms. I am going to prepare a place for you. Although I will be gone for a while, rest assured I will return. You know the way to where I am going, don't you?
Jesus' question felt cryptic to the disciples. They did not fully understand what he was saying, although they had an inkling he was speaking of heaven.
Lord,
Thomas said,
we do not know where you're going. How can we possibly know the way?
Jesus leaned forward and held out his hands. His expression was resolute and kind.
Thomas,
Jesus replied with a soft tone.
I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. Where I am going is to my Father's house, and no one can come to the Father except through me.
Will you show us the Father?
Philip asked eagerly.
How long have I been with you, Philip?
Jesus replied,
Do you not truly know me by now? Whoever has looked upon me has looked upon the Father. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. Truly I say to you, whoever believes in me will see the same power work through them. Whatever you ask in my name will be done, for the Father is glorified in the Son.
John's heart beat faster as he heard Jesus' reply. He considered whether power like Jesus's was truly possible. The miracles Jesus had performed were greater than anything anyone had ever seen. He walked and preached with the full authority of heaven behind him. How was it at all possible that the disciples of Jesus could also perform such miracles?
Do you love me, John?
Jesus asked. John nodded.
Whoever loves me will keep my commandments. I will ask the Father to bless you, and he will give you the Helper to be with you and guide you. He is the Spirit of truth.
Jesus pointed to his heart and continued, saying,
The world cannot receive the Spirit. They cannot see him or know him. But you, my precious disciples, will know him. He will dwell with you and be in you. Rest assured, I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you and comfort you with my Spirit. In the same way I live, you will live. Whoever keeps my commandments to love one another is the one who truly loves me.
Jude furrowed his brow, trying his best to understand.
Lord, why are you showing yourself to us, but not to the world?
Jesus nodded in understanding.
My presence is for those who love me and keep my word.
The disciples were growing anxious. Jesus had spoken to them many times about his power, glory, and kingdom. However, this time he was speaking as if these were his final words. They desperately desired to remember every small detail of what he was saying. They wanted to keep it close to their hearts. Jesus could sense their anguish. He looked up for a moment. There was a small gap in the tree covering. The clouds were moving fast, but still no rain.
I am telling you these things now while I still can. But do not worry. The Helper, the Holy Spirit, will teach you all things and bring everything to your remembrance. He testifies to my name and will never say anything that does not glorify my name. Remember, it is peace that I leave you with. My peace is a gift for you. It is not a fickle peace like the world gives. It is an internal and eternal peace that can never be taken away from you. Do not allow your hearts to succumb to fear. Just because I am talking about leaving does not mean you will truly be alone. I am telling you these things so that when you see them unfolding, your faith will be strengthened.
Jesus rose from the root he was sitting on. He raised his arms, gesturing for the disciples to stand.
Let us rise. I will no longer be talking much. The ruler of this world is coming. He lurks like a prowling lion, awaiting his moment to strike.
Jesus looked back into the shadows. Satan was lurking in the distance, ready to bring death upon the Son of Man. Jesus gave a determined gaze into the darkness and spoke to his disciples, saying,
The enemy has no claim on me. No one takes me. Everything I do is at my Father's command.
Jesus and his disciples carried on through the garden. Roots sprung up from the ground beside the brook Kidron like large serpents. Long ago, David once passed this same brook while running from his enemies. Jesus paused and looked at the water flowing downwards. The runoff from the temple sacrifices made the water turn red. Blood and water flowed from the temple. There was a long silence. The fog slithered its way through the trees. Jesus turned to his disciples and said,
Abide in me, as I abide in you. There is no branch here in this garden that bears fruit on its own. It must be attached to the vine with its roots deep. Just as a branch cannot bear fruit by itself, neither can you bear fruit unless you abide in me. Bear fruit. For if a branch does not bear fruit, what use is it but to be destroyed in the fire? Abide in my love, and all else will come afterwards.
Jesus continued to walk. He was marching up a small hill. John looked at Jesus' knees as they walked. They were trembling slightly. Something about Jesus did not seem right. Jesus tucked in his robe and continued to talk.
Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down his life for his friends.
Jesus then turned around with a weary smile.
You are my friends if you do what I have commanded you. A servant has no idea what his master is really up to, but his friends do. I have called you my friends, so I have shown you my will.
There was an echo of men in the far distance. The disciples looked back in fear, unable to make out where the sound came from. Jesus continued to walk, unfazed by the noise.
If the world hates you, know that it is me they really hate. The world loves its own. They are people who go day by day living as though their souls have no value. You are not of this world, therefore they will hate you. Remember, my friends, I told you earlier that a servant is no greater than his master. If they persecute me, expect them to persecute you as well.
Jesus remained at a distance from his disciples. His face was covered by the darkness of night. They could not see it, but beads of sweat were dripping from Jesus' forehead. Small slivers of moonlight swayed in and out of sight. The crisp evening air was a sweet balm to Jesus' anxious spirit. Jesus looked up. It was time for him to be alone with the Father.
I know many things I have said to you are a mystery. The hour will come when I will no longer speak to you in figures of speech. You will see things for what they are. I have said all these things to you that you may have peace. This world will be filled with tribulation. The world will seek to sink its teeth into your necks. They will treat you like an enemy and slander you. It will not be easy, but take heart. I have overcome the world.
Jesus lifted his eyes to heaven in the presence of his disciples. He prayed that they would be unified as he and the Father are unified. He prayed for a deep and abiding love between him and them. He prayed that they would be rooted in his word and remain joyful in the midst of trouble. In all things, Jesus always considered his sheep. The leaves above them rustled with the wind. Jesus' face was slightly illuminated by the dim moonlight shining through the clouds above. The air had a cold bite. Jesus turned around to look at a small opening in the trees. A large stone was sitting in the middle like an altar, glowing from the moon above.
I must pray,
Jesus whispered. He turned to the 11 and said,
Sit here while I go to pray.
They remained where they were, except Peter, James, and John, who followed him. Jesus was trembling, and the cold air began to sting. As the fog rolled away with the breeze, Peter caught a glimpse of Jesus' eyes. They were weary, like one who had toiled through the night with a sickness. Jesus looked at Peter, James, and John.
My soul is in anguish.
he said, short of breath.
It hurts to the point of death. Please remain here and pray with me.
The disciples nodded without saying a word, allowing Jesus to hobble slowly to the stone altar. Jesus' shivering body walked to the opening between the trees. He looked up to see the moon peeking out from the clouds. His jaw quivered. He closed his eyes and fell to the ground. Jesus' face was on the floor. He clenched fistfuls of dirt and grass as he prayed vigorously to the Lord. Tears streamed down his wincing face.
My Father,
He cried.
if it be possible, let this cup pass from me.
A soft and steady stream of tears watered the grass below. His weeping was quiet, but poured forth from a deep well of pain within him. Since before time itself, Jesus had existed in perfect unity with the Father. Yet now, as he wept beside a cold stone and wet grass, he was feeling the anticipation of separation. He looked to heaven again and sighed.
Nevertheless, I will submit to your will completely.
Jesus knew that if there was any other way besides death, God would have supplied it. Yet this was the only way. One must die, so all may live. Jesus buried his face in his hands and took a deep breath. He looked over to Peter, James, and John a few yards away. They were leaning against the trees, fast asleep. Jesus rose up, faltering towards them. He tapped Peter's foot with his. Peter arose with a gasp, drawing his sword. He saw Jesus standing in front of him. Peter sheathed his sword, embarrassed.
You could not watch with me for 1 hour, Peter.
Jesus said with a sigh.
All of you, pray lest you enter into temptation. You may think you have strength, but although the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak.
John watched Jesus walk slowly back to the stone. He rested his elbows against the flat part of the stone and lifted his eyes to heaven.
Father,
Jesus prayed.
if this cup is mine to drink, I shall drink it. Your will be done.
His eyes winced shut. He prayed in agony into the night. His hands shook, and from his forehead dropped blood from his pores. His prayers were so deep and so powerful that his very body was beginning to break. The clouds above began to stir once again, and the moon appeared. Jesus banged his fist against the hard stone, allowing the sound to echo through the garden. From the wind came an angel from heaven. He came to minister to Jesus and strengthen him. The entire cosmos was about to shift. Even the angels themselves were preparing for what was to come. Jesus stood up to his feet and inhaled the strength of God's Spirit. His weary eyes became more focused and intent. He turned again to the disciples. Peter, James, and John had fallen asleep again. Jesus smiled and turned his face to heaven. He prayed a third time, being emboldened by God. Then he walked over to the three. Jesus stood over them a while. James woke up to see Jesus.
Get your rest, James. You will need it.
Jesus said.
The hour has come. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of sinners. Now rise. My betrayer is at hand.
The ground shook underneath them. They could hear the marching of soldiers approaching. Jesus turned calmly to his left. Like a wolf emerging from his den, Judas came forth from the shadows of the trees. Behind him were over 100 torches. Jesus stood at a distance with his disciples. The soldiers were about 100 yards away. It was enough distance for Jesus to run, If they fled now to the wilderness, they could find shelter back in Bethany with Lazarus. The blood-stained brook Kidron trickled downhill. It stood as a separator between Jesus and his betrayer. Jesus went to the edge of the brook. He looked down at the red water flowing loudly. He looked up, watching dozens of temple soldiers line up behind Judas. With a large step, Jesus crossed the brook Kidron and went towards his enemies. The Son of God would not run from death. He would face it with power. He plucked an olive from the tree next to him. He pressed it tightly in his hand. He opened his palm to see oil spilling forth from the olive. Gethsemane means oil press. Fitting, since Jesus was about to be pressed for everything he had.
How do we know which one is him?
The captain asked Judas. Judas looked in the distance. He saw Jesus walking towards them with his disciples close behind.
The one I embrace will be the one you must capture.
Judas said.
Do it quickly, though. You do not know how much power he holds.
The band of men unsheathed their swords and trailed Judas at a distance. Judas walked toward Jesus with a smile.
Rabbi.
Then he met Jesus, embraced him, and kissed him on the cheek. Jesus held Judas's shoulders. He looked at him intently. There was righteous fury, compassion, and love swirling behind his eyes all at once. With the overwhelming voice of God, Jesus answered Judas and said,
Judas, do you really betray the Son of Man with a kiss?
As he said this, the guards marched forward with their swords drawn. Jesus walked past Judas, meeting his enemies face to face. Jesus stretched his arms out and asked,
Whom do you seek?
Jesus of Nazareth.
They answered. The wind began to swirl above them. The trees shook as if hissing at the approaching guards. With the thunder rolling in the distance, Jesus answered,
I am he.
And as he said this, the men were sent flying through the air as if lifted by a mighty wind. They fell onto their backs, dropping their swords and torches. Jesus stood there, motionless. His face was stoic and impassive. Then men leapt to their feet, keeping a safe distance between them and Jesus. With a single word, Jesus was able to flatten dozens of armed soldiers. There would be no mistaking it. If Jesus was captured, it would be because he went willingly. No man held any power over the Son of God. Yet he did not capitalize. He stayed where he was and asked again.
Whom do you seek?
The men looked at one another. With trepidation, they stepped closer and answered.
Jesus of Nazareth.
Jesus nodded.
As I said, I am he. You may take me, but let these men behind me go.
He gestured to the disciples.
I will not lose anyone God has given me.
The soldiers nodded and approached Jesus with rope to bind him. Before they had a chance to touch him, Peter leapt into the crowd with his sword drawn. The mad fisherman swung his sword with passion and fury.
Run, master!
Peter yelled. Peter slammed his shoulders into two guards, toppling them to the ground. He swung madly and chaotically, causing the guards to step back.
Run, Jesus, run!
Peter shouted again. He ran towards the group of men closest to Jesus with his sword high in the air. One of the soldiers met his sword with his, but Peter retaliated with a swift upswing. He missed, slicing off a servant's ear. The servant shrieked in pain, falling to the ground. He grasped the side of his head, screaming. Paying little attention, Peter lifted his sword to continue his attack. The soldiers lunged at him, tackling him to the ground. Peter writhed under the weight of several men. He yelled, breaking free from a few of their holds. He picked up his sword and raised it, ready to administer another blow.
Stop this!
Jesus demanded. Peter stopped and looked at Jesus. Jesus walked towards the servant. His name was Malchus, and he could not have been older than 17. He winced in pain on the floor, unable to console himself.
Put your sword in its sheath, Peter.
Jesus commanded.
For those that live by the sword shall die by the sword.
As Jesus said these words, he knelt down beside Malchus and touched the side of his head. He released his hand, and Malchus's ear was restored. Jesus stood up and smiled. Before Malchus could utter a thank you, one of the guards swung into Jesus' side, toppling him to the ground. Jesus fell to the floor with a heavy thud. He held his side, looked up, and had a bag placed over his head. With rope binding his hands, the Son of God was carted off to face trial. The disciples ran in every direction, afraid to meet the tip of a guard's spear. All of them fled for safety. All but Peter, who trailed the guards at a safe distance. Jesus was thrown onto the cold stone floor. He was unable to brace himself as his hands were tied behind his back. He lay there on the floor until a guard lifted him up and removed the bag. Jesus looked around. The room was lit by torches, and tapestries arrayed the walls. At the end of the room, under the flickering firelight, was Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas. He was an older man and held himself with great esteem. However, Jesus knew this was only a small stop on his way to the high priest.
Tell me,
Annas said,
what exactly is it that you preach?
Jesus knew that Annas was trying to get Jesus to admit to being God. That was the only way the high priest would be able to condemn him. Jesus held his head up. It throbbed from being struck so many times. He looked at Annas and said,
Everything I have said openly. Nothing I have done has been done in secret. Why do you even ask me? Ask those who...
Before Jesus could finish, the officer standing near him struck him in the jaw. Jesus fell back onto the ground, spitting up blood.
Is that how you talk to a priest?
The officer yelled. Jesus rolled over onto his back, gathering his thoughts. His ears were ringing from the blow to his head. He sat up and looked at the guard. His hair fell over his face, and he breathed heavily.
If what I have said is wrong, judge me for that. However, if what I am saying is correct, you have no reason to strike me.
Jesus was able to gain his composure for a moment before being bagged again and sent to Caiaphas, the high priest. He could hear the clamoring of religious officials through the burlap bag over his head. Their mumbles of disdain echoed throughout the hallways of the temple courts. They lifted the bag over his head. Jesus could see an entire courtroom of Pharisees, Sadducees, priests, and scribes. They had all unified and gathered under the single mission of putting Jesus to death. At the center of the courtroom sat Caiaphas, adorned in jewels and fine fabrics. His high priestly robes glimmered in the torchlight in contrast to his dark and brooding face. Jesus had never seen such a scowl before. Caiaphas stood to his feet, pointing to the Son of Man.
Jesus of Nazareth,
Caiaphas sneered. His scowl turned into a slight grin.
you are here to be tried for your crimes against God and his temple. You have led people astray with your teaching and blasphemed against God himself by claiming equality with him. Furthermore, you have threatened our entire way of life. Before you stand witnesses to your corruption. Soon, the whole world will know who you really are.
Jesus remained silent. He looked forward, content to allow any charge to be thrown against him. It did not matter. He knew his destination was already set. He knew that no matter what, Golgotha awaited him. Caiaphas called a witness to the stand. He had been hired by the priests to bear false witness against him. The man stood and pointed at Jesus, saying,
He claimed to be the one to make the temple, and he would destroy the temple and rebuild it within 3 days.
More witnesses came after him, misconstruing his words and spitting false narratives. The entire courtroom erupted in rage. They spat in his direction and cursed him. Jesus allowed the barrage of ridicule to come his way. He would not defend himself. Caiaphas opened his arms and raised his voice.
You have heard it. What have you to say for yourself, Jesus?
Jesus remained silent. This irritated Caiaphas. He pursed his lips and furrowed his brow. Banging on the table in front of him, he yelled,
Tell us, Jesus. Tell us that you claim to be Christ. Tell the whole room that you have made claims to be the Son of Jehovah.
Jesus raised his head and met Caiaphas's gaze. A chill was sent slithering down the high priest's spine. Jesus was bound by ropes. His face was bruised from the guards. However, Caiaphas was not talking to a victim. He was not speaking with a criminal on trial or a scared citizen. Caiaphas was speaking to the Lion of Judah, the Alpha and Omega, the chosen hero of God. Caiaphas stepped back lightly and awaited Jesus' reply.
I am as you said,
Jesus said plainly.
and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. You will see him ascend to the heavens and be glorified.
Ah!
Caiaphas yelled. He tore his robes, and precious stones fell to the floor. He stood and stormed towards Jesus. He approached violently and spat in his face. Jesus stood there with the priest's scorn dripping down his cheek. He said nothing. He did nothing.
What further evidence do you need?
Caiaphas yelled to the crowd. He turned to the procession of priests, elders, and religious leaders.
What is your verdict?
He asked. The men loomed over Jesus, elevated on their judgment seats. They rose to their feet and pointed.
Guilty of blasphemy,
They yelled. It was a crime punishable by death. Each took turns spitting in his face. Some even struck him where he stood. The filth of man was beginning to cake itself on Jesus' face. He would soon wear their sins as well. Caiaphas grinned and had the guards escort him to Pontius Pilate. The Jews did not want their hands dirty. If they wanted someone like Jesus dead, they needed the Romans to do it for them. The guards put the bag over his head and escorted him into the temple courtyards. Peter was warming himself by the fire outside. A few guards, servants, and bystanders were with him. He watched as Jesus was dragged out of the temple and thrown onto the ground. Jesus winced in pain as he fell to the floor. Jesus rose to his knees only to have a guard sucker punch him with the bag over his head. Jesus' skull slammed onto the dirt. He could hear ringing in his ears, followed by the muffled laughter of the guards. Jesus stood to his feet only to have another fist uppercut him in the jaw. Jesus flew back, landing on the steps behind him.
They say you are a prophet.
One of the guards said.
If this is true, how about you prophesy who did this?
The guard landed another blow to Jesus' ribs. Jesus rolled over in pain, slowly falling down the steps. They removed Jesus' bag and lifted him up by his beard. As Jesus' face was hanging by his beard in the guard's hands, his eyes peered over the fire. His eyes met Peter's for a brief moment before Peter turned back in shame. Jesus was bound again and taken away to Pontius Pilate. They passed the fire where Peter stood. He hid his face under his hood. Warming herself by the other side of the fire was a small servant girl. She scanned Peter closely and got his attention.
You were with Jesus, weren't you?
She asked.
You were one of the 12, are you not?
Peter's eyes darted to her quickly. He shrugged, doing his best to look inconspicuous.
Of course not.
Peter replied.
I have certainly heard of him, but I've never met him.
A guard was also by the fire. He looked closer at Peter and nodded.
No, she's right. I remember you. You are one of his friends.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Peter returned quickly. The charcoal fire burned red hot. Its dark smoke was pungent and thick. It had an unmistakable scent that flustered Peter.
You must have me mistaken with someone else.
Peter clarified.
No, your accent betrays you. You are a Galilean.
Another said. Peter lunged forward and took the man by his cloak.
How many times must I say it?
Peter cursed.
I do not know the man. I never have.
As he was still speaking, Peter heard the rooster crow. He looked behind him, where Jesus was being bound and taken. As the rooster was still crowing, Peter locked eyes with Jesus. Peter remembered Jesus' words when he said,
"Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times.
As Jesus was carted away, Peter fell to his knees.
What have I done?
He said. Tears streamed down his face as he watched his Lord and King being carted off like an animal. It was the last time he would see Jesus before his death, and he had denied him. The agony and shame was almost too much for Peter to bear. Peter ran from the fire and hid himself. There, he wept bitterly until the sun rose. Standing at a distance was Judas. He looked down at his 30 pieces of silver. They didn't feel right in his hands. They trembled, and he put the pouch back in his cloak. A tinge of regret sparked in Judas as he watched Jesus tumble down the temple steps. He watched them bind Jesus, strike him, and throw him around like a dog. His stomach churned as he listened to the pained grunts of his master. Memories of Jesus healing the sick and restoring sight to the blind flooded Judas's mind. It was unbearable to think of Jesus being put to death because of him. He banged on his head and began to cry in anxious dread. He yelled and ran towards the temple courtroom. He burst through the doors and threw the money bag back at Caiaphas.
"Please!"
he yelled.
"Take your money! Take it! I do not want Jesus to suffer!"
Caiaphas chuckled.
What am I to do with this?
He asked.
What's done is done.
Judas frantically shook his head. Nervous tears filled his eyes.
No, 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 no!
He yelled.
I did not know he would be put to death! I have sinned and betrayed innocent blood!
Judas fell to his knees, begging Caiaphas to reconsider. The high priest scoffed.
Get up. You're an embarrassment. Take your money and be in peace. A worker is worth his wages.
With that, Judas was escorted out of the temple walls. Judas was thrown onto the floor. He lay there for a long while. His eyes were blanketed with regret. He rose to his feet. Sweat, tears, and blood dripped down his cheeks. Judas hobbled his way towards an olive tree. He looked up. The clouds above were thrashing, ready to burst. Judas shook his head. His eyes were glazed over as he threw a nearby rope up onto the tree. He climbed it, tied a noose around his neck, and jumped off the branch. The rope tightened, and Judas's body flailed for a long moment. The sound of tightening rope and rustling leaves cut through the silence of the early morning. Then, as the sun rose, Judas breathed his last breath. The priests emerged from the temple early that morning to see Judas's body gently swinging to the breeze. They recoiled in disgust and had the guards take his body to be buried. He would stay in that grave forever. For Judas, death was a final seal of fate. It was an all-consuming pit of darkness. Yet he was proof that even the worst among us are not beyond the compassionate acts of Jesus. Jesus, knowing full well the wickedness of Judas, still washed his feet he still broke bread with him and loved him. It was this selfless love that would strip death of its finality.
This episode could properly be summarized by Jesus' words to his disciples, "The enemy has no claim on me. No one takes me. Everything I do is at the Father's command." Jesus was never out of control or a victim of circumstance. He was resolute with every decision, calm as he spoke with his disciples, and steadfast in the face of persecution. This episode gives contrast between Jesus and everybody else. While the world around him is descending into chaos, Jesus is in complete control. Did you notice how frenetic, weak, and anxious everybody else was in this episode? His disciples were confused and unable to stay awake. Peter was brash and fearful. Judas was shifty and overcome with guilt. The religious leaders were angry and manic. Yet Jesus was calm in the midst of it all. None of this caught him by surprise. Jesus faithfully endured everything because he knew the cross was his ultimate goal. "I have said all these things to you that you may have peace. This world will be filled with tribulation. The world will seek to sink its teeth into your necks. They will treat you like an enemy and slander you. It will not be easy, but take heart, I have overcome the world." Jesus offers his strength to us. He has overcome all that seeks to consume us. His encouragement to his disciples and to us was to take heart. Stand up straight with confidence. The champion of the world is on your side. Paul says in Romans 8, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? No. In all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us." Jesus' strength was exemplified at the brook Kidron. The water was red from the sacrifices made at the temple. A river of blood and water would flow from Jesus soon as well. The scene at the brook was supposed to connect back to our prelude, where David crossed over to run away from his enemies. He was betrayed by someone close to him and afraid of what might happen. Hundreds of years later, Jesus was pursued by his betrayers. But instead of running away, he stepped over the brook and pursued them. Jesus didn't consider the guards, the Romans, or the priests worthy adversaries. Not even death was his equal. Jesus is the maker of the universe, captain of the storm, and commander of the armies of God. Who can stand against him? And if he is for you and me, who can stand against us? Jesus reminded everyone that he is in charge when the gods pursued him. With the simple phrase, "I am," they were launched onto their backs. There is a hidden message in the phrase, "I am." The gods were asking about Jesus, but he responded by telling them, "I am God." He set the tone, reminding all of us that he was not a victim of these captors. With just a word, he could end them, but instead, he allowed them to bind him. He had confidence, but the disciples did not share that confidence. When we lack confidence in our identities, we can easily slip. This happened to several of the disciples, namely Peter, who drew his sword to protect Jesus and then denied him 3 times later that evening. Peter was spiraling, teetering between anger and fear. Jesus was taken to the high priest to be questioned and condemned. All they needed from him was an admission he was the Son of God. That was enough to justify taking his life. They goaded and prodded, but Jesus remained silent. Finally, Caiaphas demanded a response, and Jesus declared before the entire group of people, "I am as you said, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. You will see him ascend to the heavens and be glorified." It's frustrating to think about the Jews basking in their victory. They probably thought they were so clever to get a confession out of Jesus. He gave them what they wanted, but in a greater sense, they were giving him what he wanted. He wanted to be tried before Herod. He wanted to go before Pilate. He wanted the cross. Jesus was escorted out violently just a few yards away from where Peter stood. He was warming himself by the fire, trying to see what was happening. The fire is an important icon for future episodes. Keep in mind, there is only one other time it mentions a charcoal fire like this in Scripture. That's a tease for a future episode. Peter's popularity betrayed him, and people began to question him regarding his relationship to Jesus. 3 times Peter denied Christ, just as Jesus predicted. After the third time, the rooster crowed and Peter locked eyes with Jesus. Could you imagine that type of pain? Out of fear and anxiety, Peter rejected Jesus as he was being beaten to a pulp. Where did all that bravery for Jesus go? This episode doesn't give us any closure regarding Peter, nor does it give us hope that Jesus will escape. The episode ends in darkness. Judas, reeling in shame, took his own life, and the disciples remained scattered. All of Jesus' friends were gone, and the crowd that once shouted praises to him would soon curse him and chant, "Crucify him." The hero of the world had to endure suffering alone. This was his fate and his joy. Join us next time for Jesus' final battle over death. Episode 18 is coming. It is finished. Thanks again for listening. For more inspiring stories, daily prayers, and wisdom to last a lifetime, go to pray.com. And to expand your Heroes in the Bible journey, download the Heroes of the Faith devotional at tonyevans.org/heroes. Please write a review and let us know how Jesus and this podcast has impacted your life. God bless.